Inside the crisis, London never admitted. It didn't explode in one headline. It spread quietly, like a crack under perfect marble. And London did everything it could to keep you from seeing it. To understand a crisis London never admitted, we have to understand how financial power protects itself. Not with speeches, not with denial, with silence, structure, and the ability to keep markets functioning even while something inside them is breaking. Because in modern finance, perception is stability, and stability is survival. London has always been skilled at surviving. It has survived wars, crashes, political upheaval, and the collapse of entire empires. But the most dangerous crises aren't always the ones that make history books. Sometimes a real crisis is the one that gets managed so efficiently it never becomes a public event. And that matters today because the same pattern still exists. The world believes stability is normal, but stability is often manufactured, maintained through emergency liquidity, quiet negotiations, and invisible decisions made to stop panic before it spreads. The first beat of this story begins with confidence. London's markets run on it. The city's reputation is built on it. Global institutions depend on it. And when confidence weakens, even slightly, the entire system becomes sensitive. A rumor can trigger a wave. A sudden price movement can expose a fragile position. A single failure can force others to scramble. So when a hidden crisis begins, the first instinct is not to announce it. The first instinct is to contain it. The second beat arrives with the quiet signs. Liquidity becomes tighter. Spreads widen. Counterparties become cautious. Deals that used to happen automatically start requiring reassurance. People inside the system feel the temperature change long before the public ever hears a word. And then comes the third beat. Intervention. Not dramatic rescue. Not public bailouts, but subtle support. A well-timed line of liquidity, a regulatory adjustment, a private conversation between institutions that cannot afford to let the machine stop. Because if the machine stops, the story becomes real. And if the story becomes real, confidence collapses. So the crisis stays in the shadows, hidden behind normal market noise. The headlines remain calm. The city keeps moving. And the public is told everything is fine. But inside the system, something is shifting. Something that London doesn't want to admit. Because admitting it would mean admitting the one thing finance fears most, that it is not in control. Because the truth is, London doesn't need to deny a crisis. It only needs to outpace it. When you sit at the center of global finance, you learn how to manage danger before it becomes visible. Not by fixing the underlying problem immediately, but by preventing the chain reaction. The city is built to keep moving, and motion itself can hide instability. That's how the crisis stays unadmitted. The second layer of the story begins with the way stress spreads through markets. It doesn't spread like fire. It spreads like doubt. One institution hesitates. Another notices. Liquidity tightens. Prices become jumpy. Risk models start flashing warnings. But the public sees nothing because the system is designed to look smooth, until it isn't. Inside London's financial network, stress often shows up in small, technical ways. A sudden demand for collateral, a spike in overnight funding costs, a shift in how banks treat each other's risk. These changes sound boring, but they are the heartbeat of panic. Because panic doesn't start with people screaming. It starts with people refusing to lend. And when lending slows, the system begins to starve. This is where the first reveal becomes clearer. London's crisis management is built into its architecture. Clearinghouses can adjust margins instantly. Banks can hoard liquidity without saying a word. Regulators can quietly loosen constraints. Central institutions can provide emergency support through channels that never make the evening news. The goal is simple. Keep confidence intact. Because once confidence breaks, everything becomes public. The next beat is where the tension rises. The city's survival strategy often involves shifting the burden, not always intentionally, but structurally. When liquidity tightens, smaller players feel it first. When collateral demands rise, weaker balance sheets crack first. When funding becomes expensive, the most exposed institutions are forced to sell assets, and those forced sales ripple outward. Prices fall, volatility rises, more collateral is demanded, more selling begins. A feedback loop forms. But here's the twist. The public rarely hears a story in real time. They only hear about market turbulence. They only hear about temporary stress. They only hear about technical adjustments. London's crisis stays unadmitted because it is managed through language that turns danger into routine, and routine keeps people calm. This is where early conflict becomes sharper, because the city's ability to contain a crisis is also its ability to hide one. It can keep the system functioning while the foundation weakens. It can prevent a visible collapse while risk quietly accumulates. It can postpone the moment of truth, sometimes for years. And postponement creates a dangerous illusion that nothing is wrong, that the system is stable, that the machine is under control. But inside the city, the people closest to the flow can feel it. They feel the tightening. They feel the hesitation. They feel the fear hiding behind professionalism. And the longer the crisis stays unadmitted, the more fragile the system becomes. Because the worst moment isn't the moment stress appears. It's the moment everyone realizes it was there all along. And that is where the conflict becomes unavoidable. Because a crisis you refuse to admit doesn't disappear. It mutates. It changes shape. It moves through the system, and it finds a weakest point. London's greatest strength is its ability to keep the machine running. But that strength can also become a trap. The longer you keep moving, the harder it becomes to stop safely. This is how hidden crises grow. The city has an entire vocabulary for stress that never reaches the public. Temporary dislocation, funding pressure, volatility event, liquidity mismatch. Words that sound controlled, almost clinical, but behind them is the same fear that has haunted finance for centuries. What if nobody pays? Because once that question appears, every relationship becomes suspect. Banks stop trusting each other. Counterparties demand more collateral. Credit lines shrink. The system starts to behave like a crowd that suddenly senses danger. It becomes defensive. It becomes selfish. It becomes fast. And speed makes everything worse. The deeper reveal is that London's crisis wasn't a single event. It was a pattern, a cycle of pressure, intervention, and denial that repeats whenever the machine is pushed too hard. The system becomes strained by leverage, complexity, and dependency. Then something triggers stress. A shock, a policy shift, a sudden repricing of risk. The city responds with emergency measures that stabilize the surface, and the world moves on. But the underlying fragility remains. This is where the emotional buildup intensifies, because the crisis London never admitted is not just about banks. It's about the cost of maintaining the illusion of stability. When the system is protected at all costs, the cost doesn't vanish. It gets transferred. It lands on workers through layoffs. It lands on households through inflation. It lands on borrowers through higher rates. It lands on the public through austerity. And the city stays clean, not because it is innocent, because it is insulated. London's architecture is built to absorb shocks and keep functioning. That's why the world relies on it. But absorption is not destruction. Absorption means the shock is contained, redirected, redistributed through channels most people cannot see. So the crisis becomes everywhere, but also nowhere. And that is the terrifying brilliance of modern finance. It can spread pain without creating a single obvious moment of collapse. It can drain stability from society slowly, like pressure leaking from a sealed room, until people feel exhausted but can't point to the exact moment it began. That's the build-up toward the peak. The realization that the crisis London never admitted may have been solved in the technical sense, but not in the human sense. The markets recovered. The system survived. The headlines moved on, but the consequences stayed. They stayed in distrust. They stayed in inequality. They stayed in the sense that the game is rigged. And once that feeling spreads, it becomes its own kind of crisis. Because finance runs on belief. Not just belief in money, but belief in fairness. And when belief in fairness collapses, the system can still function, but it becomes dangerous. It becomes brittle. It becomes a machine running on fear instead of trust. And that's when you reach the emotional peak. The moment you understand that London didn't admit the crisis, because admitting it would have meant admitting something worse than instability. It would have meant admitting that the system depends on silence. That's the climax. The crisis London never admitted wasn't hidden because it didn't matter. It was hidden because it mattered too much. Because once the public sees the fragility, belief breaks. And when belief breaks, the machine doesn't just slow down. It panics. It seizes. It spreads fear faster than any government can contain. So London's system does what it was built to do. It keeps moving. It stabilizes the surface with liquidity, coordination, and quiet intervention. It turns emergency into routine. It turns danger into technical language. It turns a real crisis into a managed event that never becomes a public confession. And the world accepts it, because the alternative is terrifying. So the resolution is not a neat ending. It's a warning. The most dangerous crises are not always the loudest. They are the ones that are smoothed over so efficiently that the public never learns a lesson. The ones that disappear into spreadsheets, policy adjustments, and market recovery charts. But the consequences remain. They remain in the system's growing dependence on intervention. They remain in the public's growing distrust of finance. They remain in the sense that stability is something performed, not guaranteed. And today, that matters more than ever. Because finance is becoming faster, more automated, and more interconnected. Crises can form in hours, not months. Stress can spread through algorithms before humans even understand it. And the pressure to hide instability will only grow. Because admitting weakness in a system built on confidence is like lighting a match near fuel. What happened inside London isn't just a story about the past. It's the blueprint of modern crisis management. And the next time markets look calm, the real question is not whether everything is fine. The real question is, what had to be done to make it look that way? In